Welcome to Breaking News to Trading Moves. So right now, there is a $10,000 electric vehicle selling rapidly across consumer markets in, Europe and Mexico.
Yeah, but if you live in the United States, you just can't buy it.
Exactly. Today, we're looking at the policy mechanics keeping those lower-cost cars out of the domestic market. And, well, we're going to identify exactly who stands to win and who stands to lose in the current automotive trade landscape.
Right, because the central headline driving this whole discussion is pretty straightforward. You have U.S. automakers, domestic suppliers, steelmakers, unions, and lawmakers all formally warning President Trump.
Right, they're warning him against giving Chinese automakers easier access to the U.S. car market. And this is specifically ahead of his upcoming meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and for traders, this covers a lot of ground. I mean, we're talking policy, electric vehicles, manufacturing, domestic supply chains, and, national security.
We're dealing with policies that touch multiple sectors of the economy at once. So we're going to examine the business impacts of this headline and connect the dots for you, the listener, without any exaggeration. Who benefits from a closed door and whose balance sheet suffers?
Well, the specific concerns raised by these domestic groups really come down to structural advantages held abroad. I mean, Chinese EV makers possess lower cost models, massive scale, and state-supported supply chains.
Right. And the core issue is that granting these brands U.S. access, whether that's through direct investments, joint partnerships, or standard dealership networks, it alters competition across multiple domestic sectors.
Exactly. So let's look at the companies operating under a defensive posture. To understand the U.S. auto industry's stance, you really have to look straight at the legacy automakers.
Because they're the ones who benefit most from a protected market. Right, I'm looking at General Motors, ticker GM, and Ford, ticker F.
Right. Maintaining barriers against foreign automakers protects those legacy companies from, really aggressive pricing competition. If Washington keeps these specific manufacturers out of the U.S. market, legacy automakers maintain this protective pricing umbrella.
Because right now, GM and Ford are dealing with intense margin pressure and high EV investment costs, right?
Oh.
While consumers are facing overall affordability challenges.
Yeah, they are. The capital required to build out that EV infrastructure is just staggering.
Think of their current situation, kind of like a fortress under internal renovation. General Motors and Ford are spending heavily to upgrade the fortress while dealing with limited resources.
That's a great way to put it. They rely heavily on the profits from their current internal combustion engine lineups, especially those high-margin pickup trucks and SUVs to fund this transition.
Right, keeping the external gates closed prevents them from having to fight a price war while they're, still building their EV infrastructure.
Exactly, because if lower-cost EVs enter the market, it introduces aggressive pricing pressure across the entire automotive spectrum.
But wait, let me ask you this. If a foreign competitor introduces, like, a cheap electric sedan, why does that impact the profit margins on a domestic gas-powered pickup truck? I mean, those seem like entirely different buyers.
Well, there are different buyers at first glance, sure, but pricing pressure is contagious across the whole market. If a consumer can buy a highly capable, fully equipped electric vehicle for, say, $25,000, the perceived value of a $45,000 gas-powered crossover just drops.
Oh, I see. So automakers would be forced to lower prices on their core profit drivers just to keep consumers coming into the showrooms.
Right, and if they lower their prices, they destroy the very profit margins needed to fund their EV transition. Keeping the market protected allows them to navigate this capital-intensive period without collapsing their pricing power.
Wow, okay. And that flows directly into the purely electric domestic companies, too. We really need to look at Tesla, ticker TSLA, Rivian, ticker RIVN, and Lucid, ticker LCID.
Yeah, because foreign brands are already capturing overseas market share with their cheaper models. If they're allowed into the United States, those brands challenge both the mass market and the premium EV pricing tiers.
Well, I understand the threat to mass market vehicles.
Yeah.
But Rivian and Lucid are selling premium luxury vehicles. A buyer looking at a $90,000 Lucid isn't really cross-shopping a $15,000 budget import, right? Why do the luxury domestic makers need this protection?
Well, because the foreign automakers are no longer just making budget cars. They're manufacturing premium models with technology, interior quality, and range that rival and sometimes even exceed the domestic luxury tier.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and they're doing it at a structurally lower cost. We really have to examine the mechanics of how scale works for an EV startup versus an an established state-supported entity.
Right, because scale is essentially the process of producing enough vehicles so the fixed costs of the factory are spread out, bringing the cost to build each individual car down.
Correct. And getting to scale involves surviving what the industry calls the valley of death.
The Valley of Death. That sounds intense.
It is. You have to build the factory, hire the workers, and secure the raw materials before you sell a single car. Building the first 50,000 vehicles burns billions of dollars in cash. Domestic startups like Rivian and Lucid are currently fighting their way out of that valley.
While the competitors abroad have already achieved that scale.
They have achieved massive scale, yes. And they operate with structural state support. I mean, they control the lithium refining process, battery cell manufacturing, assembly. They own the entire recipe from the raw materials to the finished product.
So if a competitor enters the market with that structurally lower cost basis, they can just undercut domestic prices across every single tier.
Exactly. If a consumer sees a foreign premium EV with similar luxury features for like 30% less, Lucid and Rivian have to respond. The protectionist policy acts as a necessary pricing umbrella for TSLA, Rivian, and LCID. It gives them the financial cover to actually operate and scale.
Right, okay. But, vehicles aren't built in a vacuum. Protecting the automakers naturally extends a shield over the companies providing their parts and materials, right?
Yeah.
Let's look at the supply chain.
Yeah, let's do that. Because if foreign automakers are blocked from gaining major U.S. market access, domestic auto suppliers and steel producers avoid losing market share to imported or foreign-backed supply chains.
So moving up the manufacturing chain to the suppliers, the companies to watch are Aptiv, ticker APTV, Borg-Warner, ticker BWA, and Genuine Parts, ticker GPC.
Right.
But wait, why wouldn't a foreign automaker just set up an assembly plant in the U.S. and buy their parts from domestic suppliers like Aptiv or Borg-Warner?
Well,
Wouldn't that create a win for the domestic supply chain?
you'd think so, but historically, foreign automakers expanding globally bring their own established networks of suppliers with them. They operate as integrated ecosystems.
Oh, I see. So when they build a plant in a new country, their preferred component manufacturers just build facilities right next door.
Exactly. They don't typically integrate into the existing domestic supply chain.
So if you allow the foreign automaker in, you're also allowing their proprietary wire harness manufacturers, their electric motor suppliers, and thermal management companies to just enter the market alongside them.
Yeah, and those foreign suppliers immediately take market share away from Aptiv and Borg-Warner. Blocking the final product at the border protects the ecosystem of component manufacturers operating domestically.
It's the exact same principle for the raw materials, too. The domestic steelmakers to track here are Nucor, ticker NUE, and Steel Dynamics, ticker STLD.
Right, because Nucor and Steel Dynamics supply the raw steel for domestic vehicle manufacturing. Automotive contracts provide massive, predictable volume for these steel mills.
So if domestic auto production is protected, the steelmaker's core customer base remains intact.
Exactly. If market share moves to imported vehicles, well, those imported vehicles are built with imported steel. The protective shield really covers the assembly plant, the parts manufacturer, and the steel mill.
That makes total sense. Before we move on to the losers, let me ask you about the retail side for a moment, specifically the dealerships. Because the bizarre truth about car dealers right now is that they actually seem to want to sell fewer cars. It sounds totally counterintuitive. I mean, if U.S. dealers are protected from selling cheaper models, aren't they just locking themselves into selling fewer, more expensive cars? A volume game seems like the standard retail approach.
Well, the reality of dealership economics prioritizes margin and inventory management over sheer volume. For U.S. dealers, the immediate benefit of this policy is avoiding cutthroat showroom competition.
Right.
They would much rather sell one $60,000 truck and make a healthy profit than sell three $20,000 imports with, microscopic profit margin.
And that really comes down to inventory holding costs.
Right.
I mean, a dealership has to borrow money to buy the cars sitting on their lot, a process called floor plan financing.
Exactly. When a dealership fills a massive lot with cheap cars, the clock starts ticking on their financing costs. If those cars sit for too long, the interest payments just eat the dealer alive. Limiting competition from cheaper models protects their current higher margin business model.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's explore the opposite side of the policy now. We really need to look at the companies relying on a globally connected market, the ones that stand to lose if U.S. policy becomes more restrictive. Let's start with direct foreign exposure.
Right, so we're looking at global automakers and low-cost EV expansion plays, specifically companies based in China that trade on U.S. exchanges.
Because these equities are directly exposed to investor sentiment regarding their global expansion. The names here are NIO, ticker NIO, Li Auto, ticker LI, and XPeng, ticker XPEV.
Yeah. If U.S. policy limits their access, it really caps the long-term thesis that these low-cost EV makers can eventually access the American consumer base. Wall Street prices these equities based on their total addressable market, or TAM.
And the total addressable market is the maximum potential revenue a company can generate if they capture 100% of their target market.
Exactly.
By cutting off access to the United States, you are literally removing one of the most lucrative consumer markets on the planet from their spreadsheet.
Yeah, you are. The investment thesis for NIO, LI, and XPEV relies heavily on their ability to continually expand. I mean, they are capturing share in Europe and Mexico, but the ultimate prize for global automotive expansion is the U.S. consumer.
Yeah.
When policies lock that door, their long-term valuation potential drops in the eyes of investors. The ceiling on their future growth becomes measurably lower.
And here's where the market data presents a pretty compelling paradox. Some of the biggest winners from this protectionist policy are also on the losers list.
Yeah, this is the complicated partnership trade.
Right. We are talking about General Motors, ticker GM, Ford, ticker F, and Tesla, ticker TSLA. We literally just discussed them as winners who benefit from a protected domestic market. How does a company occupy both sides of this trade?
Well, it comes down to their international manufacturing footprint. General Motors, Ford, and Tesla operate vast supply chains and manufacturing centers overseas, and they're heavily embedded in China.
Right. Tesla manufactures a massive volume of vehicles at its Shanghai facility, both for domestic sale within China and for export to other regions.
Exactly, and Legacy Automakers rely on long-standing joint ventures in that specific region to produce and sell vehicles.
So they rely on that region for a large percentage of their global revenue and their manufacturing capacity. Meaning, if Washington implements tighter policies at home, it introduces severe risk for those companies abroad.
Yeah, because protectionism creates political friction, and that friction makes overseas operations highly vulnerable. If the U.S. blocks foreign vehicles, the retaliatory response could involve, regulatory hurdles, supply chain complications, or just increased difficulty operating within a market those U.S. companies really rely on.
Wow. So General Motors, Ford, and Tesla get a protective fortress at home, but the very policy protecting them domestically turns their international operations into a huge liability.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword.
Well, let's take the conversation from the manufacturing floor straight to consumer wallets. We need to map out how this macro policy impacts everyday vehicle affordability and the auto retailers.
Yeah, because the U.S. vehicle affordability problem is a known issue for consumers. The average price of a new vehicle remains really elevated.
And by blocking lower-cost vehicles, U.S. consumers continue to face a market with limited downward pricing pressure.
That is the direct trade-off. A protected domestic industry means the consumer absorbs the cost. Without the introduction of lower-cost models to, force price competition, the overall pricing floor just remains high.
So let's look at how sustained high pricing alters consumer demand. If people are priced out of the market, it directly hurts auto retail, vehicle financing, and used car sales volumes. This really comes down to the automotive fleet replacement cycle.
Right, because when new vehicles are too expensive, consumers delay their purchases. They decide to invest in repairing their current 10-year-old vehicle rather than taking on a massive new loan.
And the entire replacement cycle slows down.
Exactly. The retail companies to watch in this space are Carvana, ticker CVNA, CarMax, ticker KMX, and AutoNation, ticker AM.
Because these companies rely entirely on transaction volume.
Yeah.
Carvana and CarMax need consumers actively buying, selling, and trading in used cars to maintain their revenue streams.
Right, and if new cars remain unaffordable, people do not trade in their old cars.
And if trade-ins stop, the supply of used cars tightens. A tight supply keeps used car prices high, which then locks buyers out of the secondary market as well.
Yeah, it creates a cycle of constrained volume that directly impacts the core business model of these transaction-based retailers.
Wow. And we also have to consider the financing aspect, right? Retailers like AutoNation are heavily exposed to retail volume and the financing attached to those individual sales.
Yeah, a massive portion of their margin comes from the loan origination, the extended warranties, and the financing spread, not just the metal itself.
So if consumers face higher purchase prices, securing financing just becomes difficult. Loan amounts are larger, interest rates remain a factor, and monthly payments stretch way beyond what the average buyer can support.
Right, and that weighs on demand across the entire auto retail ecosystem. If the transaction volume drops, the highly profitable financing revenue drops right along with it.
So let's summarize the core dynamics we've discussed today. Protecting domestic legacy brands like General Motors and Ford, EV startups like Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, and the supply chains linked to Aptiv and Nucor, well, it comes at a cost.
It does.
It comes at the direct cost of companies with foreign market exposure like NIO and Li Auto, and it creates continued affordability challenges for retail platforms like Carvana and CarMax.
It really leaves you with a critical question to think about. What happens when the national push for widespread, affordable EV adoption directly collides with the desire for domestic supply chain protection? Will the market eventually just accept higher consumer prices as the permanent cost of maintaining a localized auto industry?
That is definitely something to think about. This is not financial advice or buy or sell recommendations. This is purely the opinion of the author.